One of the main questions when starting a literature review is how on earth should you go about searching the literature? And so that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. A very sensible approach is to basically try to start broad. So the best kind of tips here would be to start with review papers. Depending on your particular field, there might be journals which focus exclusively on kind of review and opinion pieces. But in almost every journal, they will have review papers here and there. So I think that is an excellent place to get a bird's eye view of the literature with in a very efficient way in terms of your time. I would say that the same is broadly true of textbooks. So I like buying kind of academic textbooks. Mostly I don't go for the kind of undergrad style textbooks because even though some of these are really excellent, there's quite a lag time between the current developments in a field and them making it into a textbook. And so I think that if you want to get a broad understanding of a new area, then textbooks can be fine, but it's not necessarily the best place where I would go. Obviously, I couldn't not mention using Wikipedia. I think that this is a completely fine way of quickly scanning a large range of topics to try and get an understanding of topics and how they relate. I'd also, maybe not so popular, but not so widely known, is the kind of arena of non-scientific publications. So lots of scientists have quite popular blog posts, and there are some really very superb, professionally put together YouTube channels, YouTube videos on topics. So of course they're not going to enable you to do all of your literature review, but if the aim is to get a broad introduction into an area that is perhaps new, these are the methods that I would recommend. After you build a broad overview of a field, you might want to get a little bit more detailed, and so clearly diving into journal articles is going to have to be one of the things that you focus on here. It's also worth looking out for journal special issues. So from time to time, journals will have guest editors, and so they would dedicate an entire issue to a particular topic. This can be, striking gold if you're trying to research about a particular area and you happen to find a special issue on or highly related to that area. That can be perfect because you just have a whole bunch of papers all highly related to the particular topic that you're interested in. Then, of course, zooming in even further, you could think about how can I get exposure to the cutting edge of what's going on here. Now, one way of doing that might be to look at conference proceedings. And so when scientists go and present their work in academic conferences, they will often write articles. They will submit abstracts to the conference. And so if you are able to kind of find some of these conference proceedings for a conference that happened in the last year or so, this will be a good way to kind of get up to speed with what are people working on right now, simply because when people go to conferences, they don't talk about work that they did 5 or 10 years ago. They talk about work that they're doing right now. Another potential avenue of information to get up to date is PhD theses. So these days, many of these are available online. Now, this isn't necessarily the first place that I would go, simply because they tend to be very highly focused. But if you can find one on the particular topic that you're interested in, then that's great. You can scan through their introduction and get a lot of exposure. But beyond that, you'll be able to really dive in deep to look at the methods that they use, and also take a look in their discussion to see, look for clues about where the field might be going. One of the kind of best places to go, I think, to get an idea of, what is happening right now is to go and look at preprint archives. And so these are becoming increasingly popular. They're being embraced by lots of different scientific areas. Certainly, physics got there before psychology, but I would say broadly psychology is really embracing the idea of preprint archives. So these are essentially online archives where scientists can upload research papers that they have just completed before they have been through peer review. I think this is, so I keep an eye on what's happening, for example, on SciArchive. Sometimes the lag between an author submitting a paper to a journal and that finally getting published can be multiple years. Sometimes it can take a year to get through an individual journal. There could be multiple rounds of revisions, but then again, of course, they could get rejected from one or even more journals. And so you would have thought that the papers being published at any given time would represent the cutting edge, but that is certainly not always the case. Much more likely to be the case, though, if you keep an eye on what's going on in the preprint archives. I'd also recommend Twitter. So Twitter can be incredibly noisy, and of course you have to be diligent in terms of who you follow. Personally, I try to use this purely in an academic sense, and I try to kind of follow people who who tweet about scientific issues and the work that they're doing. But even though I make use of muting lots of keywords, a lot of kind of political or kind of other non-scientific information can make its way through. Nevertheless, I would say my personal experience of Twitter has been very useful. I come across papers in my area, but actually just kind of on the edge of my area, which I don't think I would have actually come across otherwise. And so Twitter can be useful. Another way to go would be to look at online databases. Now, of course, there are many online databases. I'm going to just focus on Google Scholar here, simply because on a day-to-day basis, this is pretty much what I rely on. And so rather than laboriously going through loads of examples, I'm just going to highlight the use of Google Scholar. One of the kind of interesting things you can do here, of course, is you don't just have to put in article titles into Google Scholar. You can put in search terms. So this is an example result. If you put in the search term, covert, and then visual search as a phrase, putting in those quotes means it won't say yes to papers which have either visual or search in them. It will look for that actual phrase. So this is a very useful way to go. sometimes you have to kind of build up some knowledge and experience of kind of using different search terms. There's a whole art to basically saying this term and that term or that term, and yeah, there's an art to it, but that can come with practice. Another very useful thing to know about if you're using Google Scholar is if you click on this little apostrophe icon, you basically get a window up that gives you the APA reference. Now, sometimes I personally find that very useful if I am constructing slides and I want to put in a citation, but if I'm working towards a paper, I wouldn't do my references in this way. I would look at a specific reference manager, but I'm going to have a separate video on that. So just to briefly mention, of course, there is Google Scholar, but you've got PubMed, ISI, Web of Knowledge. Less well known, and I think a bit more recent, is Connected Papers, and I really like this. This is a good way of searching for stuff. So if you go to connectedpapers.com, you can basically search for a paper title. So you would pop that in the box and click the button. What comes back is it wants to check that it has got the right paper for you. So you'd see, yes, this is the top one here is the one that I was after. So you click on the build a graph picture, the button, and then you would get back something like this. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes because what you're doing is you're telling a computer somewhere off in the cloud to go and to build this graph. But what you get back in a couple of minutes is this graph which has all the nodes which represent papers, and the lines, they're called edges. They represent the connections between papers. I think one of the interesting things about Connected Papers is it's not doing this based upon who cites who. It's doing it through an analysis of keywords and things like that. You can also see these circles have different sizes, and I can't quite remember what that relates to. Maybe the number of times they're cited, but they also have different colors, and that represents when in time they were published. So I really like Connected Papers. I think it's a very useful way of searching the literature.